Songs of Conquest has been billed as a spiritual successor to the Heroes of Might and Magic games, in particular Heroes 3, which has remained popular since its original release in 1999. But while it is true that Songs of Conquest has many similar gameplay mechanics, and a similar feel to the Heroes series, there are numerous things the developers have tried to do differently. So in this video, we're going to take a look at most of the differences in more detail, so you know what to expect if you decide to move from one game to the other. Let's start with a couple of the more simple changes. In Songs of Conquest, units have what's called a zone of control, which activates when enemy units move within one tile of their position. When a unit tries to move through other units' zone of control, it will be attacked by those units without the opportunity to retaliate. The zone effectively locks units in place, as you can't withdraw from an enemy's zone of control without taking damage either. So for example, if an enemy's melee unit attacks your ranged unit, you can't then safely pull out to another part of the field. But there are some units which are more stealthy, and they can move past enemy units without worrying about the effects of zone of control, in a similar way to how all units work in Heroes 3. Another smaller but not insignificant difference is the way ranged units work. In Heroes 3, ranged units can attack enemies anywhere on the battlefield, but will deal twice as much damage to units moving within 10 tiles of their position. When an enemy occupies the tile adjacent to your ranged unit, you'll be forced into melee. That situation is the same in Songs of Conquest, but one difference is that ranged units have a limited amount of range which varies from unit to unit. If the enemy moves close enough but not adjacent to your ranged units, they enter your deadly range, in which your shot will deal double damage. Possibly the most significant difference, however, is that in Songs, ranged units can move and shoot on the same turn, but they will take a significant penalty to how much damage they can do if they don't stay in place. The game also adds a variable in the form of elevation, where units on higher ground gain significant damage multipliers in their favour. Standing on elevated hexes also increases the maximum range of ranged units. Elevated hexes can serve as a useful platform at times, but you can't move straight from the lowest to the highest hexes, meaning sometimes you need to find the shortest route to climb your way up. Before we move on from battle mechanics, one more thing to mention is that while the wait and defend commands do exist in Songs of Conquest, they aren't as universally available as in Heroes 3. Instead, those abilities are only available to specific units in order to help those units gain a competitive niche. Generally, fast units like Riders of the Swamp have the ability to wait before attacking, potentially allowing them to hit and run or to move twice in a row, whereas the defendability is typically given to slow, bulky units like Shields of Order. While I do think at the time of recording, some form of more widely distributed but perhaps weaker defendability would allow units to approach ranged units more reliably, restrictions on the wait ability do help make slower units more competitive in this game, instead of always succumbing to strategies like hit and run or kiting. Moving over to the adventure map, building up towns is also handled differently between the games. Buildings in Songs of Conquest are constructed outside of the core town itself on 3 different sizes of external building sites. You can only work on one building site per turn in each town, at least in the early game, and the number and sizes of those building sites expands as you expand your town. However, unlike in Heroes 3, there is nothing stopping you from building the same type of building multiple times in the town, as long as you have the building sites to allow it. So if you want to double down on a certain type of dwelling, you can, but that doesn't necessarily allow you to build an unstoppable power stack for reasons I'll explain later. The game does try to nudge you to build more diverse towns though. Some of the later buildings can only be built or upgraded if you've already got other buildings finished around your town. So if you're thinking long term, you'll probably want to plan which buildings to prioritize ahead of time. You can upgrade your town and work on an external building site on the same turn, however, and for veteran Heroes players that might feel a bit like getting away with building 2 things in one turn, since a town upgrade in Songs of Conquest will boost your income per turn in a similar manner to dedicated gold income buildings in Heroes 3 like the Town Hall. Another advantage of upgrading your town or capturing new ones is that doing so raises the number of Wielders you're allowed to recruit. Whereas in Heroes 3 you can recruit up to 8 heroes from the start of the game, in Songs of Conquest you can typically only recruit 1. That means your main hero or wielder will probably need to spend more time carrying out jobs you might usually delegate to one of your scouts, like picking up loose resources. But in terms of just having fun, I do really like this mechanic, just for saving you the need to worry about whether it would be more optimal to set up tedious hero chains, although you may still want to do that as you progress further into the game. But we can't really go any further without addressing one of the biggest differences of all, and probably the one I'm least convinced by, although I suspect there will be balance adjustments to this as the game undergoes further development. The change I'm referring to is the existence of unit limits. Each slot in your army can only hold a certain number of units before you need to split them into a new stack, and for many Heroes players, those limits might seem quite restrictive. Unit limits are one of the main reasons you might not want to double down on certain dwelling types, as the size of each stack is limited anyway. Typically, low-level units like rats can have a large number of units per stack, whereas high-level units like dragons can only have a much smaller number. I do think it's possible this mechanic could be tweaked or even overhauled sometime after I record this, since it does restrict some of the possibilities open to the player, but it's worth acknowledging that there are reasons for these unit limits to exist. I've already mentioned that it stops you creating overpowered doom stacks by building the same dwelling over and over, but another advantage is that it pushes you to more seriously consider distributing your armies around your wielders instead of focusing everything on your main hero. That's only further encouraged by skills like tutoring, where a percentage of experience gained by your wielder is shared out amongst your other wielders. You can also level up your command skill to get a large number of stacks at the same time, so a full strength army can still feel like an overwhelming force. Another major difference is that research exists as a mechanic in Songs of Conquest, but not Heroes 3. Building a dedicated research building on a large building site in Songs of Conquest is one of the best ways to set yourself up for the late game. You can research new techs by spending resources, and those new techs will provide benefits to things like your maximum unit sizes, unit stats, and your economy. You can also research the ability to build more than one building per day in each of your towns. That will only kick in quite far into the game, but it is another example of a situation where the games eventually branch off from each other. This next change is quite a big one, and similar to unit limits, it does limit the gameplay in some ways, but also has some advantages. In Songs of Conquest, you can't mix and match different types of towns and units. So if, for example, you're playing as Loth, and you come across an external dwelling for a creature from Barrier's lineup, you won't be given the opportunity to recruit those units yourself. Instead, you'll pillage the dwelling for gold. If you capture an undeveloped neutral settlement, it will immediately flip to your faction. And if you capture a developed enemy town, you'll be presented with a few choices on what to do with it, sort of like in the Civilization series. You could occupy the town, rendering it largely useless, but gaining a potentially significant amount of resources from it each turn. You can convert it to your faction by placing your attacking wielder inside the settlement for a few turns until it's taken over by your faction. Or you can raise the town, destroying its buildings as you convert it to your faction type, but leaving your wielder free to explore the map. Obviously, this difference does reduce the potential for varied and interesting unit compositions, but it is worth pointing out a few advantages to this approach. In Heroes 3, a town's highest tier units will often outperform its lowest tier units, regardless of weekly unit growth. That creates a situation where you'll often give up the native units of your faction in order to get the most optimum collection of units from all available towns. The game does try to disincentivize that by giving you a morale penalty for mixing, but that often isn't significant enough a disadvantage. Another good thing about this approach is that there are potential balance issues in Heroes 3 when one player finds two towns of the same type, and the second player finds two towns of different types. In that situation, the first player could double down on the strongest units available to their faction to create unstoppable power stacks, whereas the second player can't build up individual stacks of units to the same level, and may need to give up some of their original units to bring in new ones. It does mean fewer variations of army composition are available to you, but I can see strengths and weaknesses in both approaches. Going back to a more minor change, Songs of Conquest doesn't emphasize weekly cycles like Heroes does. Instead, each dwelling produces a small number of units every turn. Obviously, that makes it harder to sneak attacks against the AI players on day 7 of a week, or even day 1 before they can recruit their units, but it also means that top tier units often aren't as powerful on an individual level as they are in Heroes 3. After all, they typically produce 7 units per week instead of 2. Combined with the high costs of recruiting these and relatively lower maximum stack sizes, individual high tier units don't feel as game changing as they do in Heroes, with the possible exception of Elder Dragons, for example. However, we've not yet covered one of the biggest differences of all, which is spellcasting. Whereas Heroes 3 spellcasting is governed by spell points, which are recharged at Wells and Mage guilds, your ability to cast spells in Songs of Conquest comes from accumulating various types of essence as the battle goes on. Essentially, you charge your spell points up over time, instead of entering battle with a limited number. Different types and amounts of essence are linked to different spells, with many spells requiring the combination of 2 different essence types. You accumulate essence through your units, with each unit contributing different types of essence every time they take their turn. That incentivizes you to split your units into as many stacks as possible to keep the essence coming, but there are risks with that too. Whenever you lose a stack of units, the enemy units gain momentum, which temporarily boosts their stats. The link between unit composition and essence generation doesn't mean there aren't massive differences between different wielders' spellcasting potential, as you can also charge essence with artifacts and with your wielder's skills or specializations. Each type of essence has its own associated skill, and leveling up your essence skills unlocks stronger spells and increases the rate of accumulation. Whether you're a fan of this change or not, it does feel like a more unique and creative take on the concept than simply rehashing the mechanics from Heroes of Might and Magic. And like everything on this list, this can be refined and improved with balance changes. And that brings me on to the issue of game depth. At the time of recording, Songs of Conquest is still in early access, but even if the game is well supported going forward, it's difficult to compete with the sheer amount of content you can get with Heroes 3, especially in mods like Horn of the Abyss. The 4 factions at the time of recording do feel quite fleshed out, and the combination of different unit categories within factions helps with this. Loth isn't just the undead faction, for example, it's a human cultist faction too, and any human units you lose will join your undead in the form of Risen. Or for example, Arlian combines your typical medieval units like swordsmen and knights with forest creatures called the Fae. But it will take the game some time to catch up with the sheer number of factions, units, or campaigns in Heroes 3, especially if you include the Heroes Chronicles campaign expansions. I do fear that faction and unit limits will limit the creativity of map creators. Some Heroes 3 custom maps can take dozens of hours to complete, with heroes accumulating massive forces of thousands of varied creatures. While I do think there are advantages of unit restrictions in standard play, I think Songs of Conquest will benefit from a more developed map editor, which allows players to override some of these limitations in some situations. But the point I want to emphasize is that Songs of Conquest is not Heroes 3, and I do think it's important to understand that and measure your expectations before you try it, especially if you decide to buy the game during early access. If you are experienced in one of the 2 games and want to try the other, I will leave a GOG affiliate link in the description where you can buy either game DRM free and support the channel at the same time. There are plenty of Heroes 3 videos on the channel, and I've got more Songs of Conquest coming too, so do subscribe if that's your thing. Thanks for watching, I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you next time.